He extended his hand with quiet dignity, and she recoiled like he was beneath her. "I don't shake hands with employees," declared Margaret Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, her voice laced with arrogance as she ignored the outstretched hand of Jonathan Ellis, a calm, sharply dressed black man in his early 40s. Around the boardroom, 5 executives exchanged amused glances, silently approving her disdain. Jonathan let his hand hover in the air for a second longer before lowering it, unbothered. He had endured moments like this before, but this time, something in his eyes hinted at a different outcome. Margaret, the heiress to a corporate empire, looked him over with thinly veiled contempt. His modest attire, carefully chosen, had fooled her completely. To her, he was just another consultant sent by investors, not worth more than a few condescending remarks. But what she didn't know was that Jonathan wasn't there to ask for anything. He was there to observe, and every insult, every dismissive gesture was being mentally catalogued and discreetly recorded. Because this meeting wasn't just about numbers. It was a test, one that Margaret Whitmore was already failing, word by word, without even knowing it. From the moment he stepped into the sleek marble lobby of Whitmore Dynamics, Jonathan Ellis had already anticipated every slight, every misjudgment. He arrived exactly on time, driving a modest sedan and wearing a simple gray suit. The receptionist barely looked at him, waving him toward a side chair with an empty smile. "Please wait here, sir," she said, without checking the schedule. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. 40. 2 security guards passed him, multiple times, clearly instructed to observe but not engage. Each instance, Jonathan remained silent, calm, but alert, cataloging what no one in that building knew, not the guards, not the receptionist, and certainly not Margaret Whitmore or her smug executive team, was that Jonathan Ellis controlled one of the most powerful investment funds in the country. Ellis Capital Partners managed over $60 billion in global assets. And on that very morning, his team was considering injecting $4 billion into Whitmore Dynamics. If they passed a final evaluation, this meeting wasn't about financials. Those had already been analyzed. This was about culture, integrity, and leadership. Jonathan needed to see how the company operated when they thought no one important was watching. By the time he entered the boardroom, the performance had already begun. Margaret, seated at the head of the table like royalty, didn't even rise. She looked him over with a smirk and dismissed him with the word consultant, as if it were synonymous with irrelevant. He responded only with a small nod and a calm, "I understand perfectly." But no one in the room grasped the weight of those 4 words. For the next 30 minutes, Margaret delivered a shallow, arrogant presentation, riddled with buzzwords and inflated numbers. She didn't even glance at Jonathan as she spoke. Instead, she directed her energy toward impressing her colleagues with golden laser pointers, exaggerated graphs, and vague forecasts. "As you can see," she said proudly, "our revenue growth places us far ahead of our competitors." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Excuse me," he said, still maintaining his calm tone. "But those revenue figures don't align with your public Q2 report. There's a discrepancy of around $300 million. Silence. Margaret paused, blinking, the first sign of irritation flashing across her face. "And what exactly is your background in financial analysis, Mr. Ellis?" He answered softly. Some laughter circled the room. Margaret turned to her vice president, Douglas Crane, a barrel-chested man in his 50s. "Doug, can you believe this? Our guest thinks he understands our data better than our finance department." Douglas smirked. "Maybe we should just tell him what he wants to hear so he can file his little report and leave." But Jonathan wasn't rattled. He had lived this moment dozens of times before. In glass towers, private clubs, and boardrooms where people like him were rarely expected to lead. At 18, He'd been an intern watching clients dismiss black staff like furniture. At 25, 3 firms had thrown him out before even hearing his investment pitch. But he had outlasted them all, because while they laughed, he studied 18 hours a day, learning markets like a language, developing instincts that had made him one of the most respected minds in global finance. Now, as they mocked him, he simply adjusted the watch on his wrist, a subtle signal to his blang team 6 blocks away. His assistant, Marcus Reed, received it instantly. Phase 1 complete. As Margaret droned on about levels of excellence and pedigree, Jonathan simply observed, filing every arrogant smirk, every dismissive word. He wasn't there to win approval. He was there to watch how power behaves when it thinks it can't be challenged. Margaret continued, gesturing dramatically at the city skyline. This is the level we operate at, Mr. Ellis. We have refinement, education, connections. I imagine it must be difficult for someone like you to understand. Jonathan nodded gently. I understand perfectly. It's fascinating how often people confuse inherited privilege with actual competence. That hit hard. Her family had built the company, but only after a $50 million trust fund jumpstart. Jonathan knew it. Public records knew it. And now, Margaret knew he knew it. As tension rose, she tried to reassert control by calling for confidential project files, believing she could bury him in technical jargon. But Jonathan had already reviewed them through legal investor channels. He knew the Orion initiative was 3 years behind schedule, $600 million over budget, and riddled with red flags. Still, he remained calm. He let her finish the act, because this wasn't just a meeting. It was a test, and she had already failed. Jonathan flipped open the folder that Margaret Whitmore had tossed at him with condescension, her voice laced with venom. Let's see if you can handle our methodology. What she didn't expect was the way he scanned the pages fast, focused, precise. In under 15 minutes, he pinpointed 3 major accounting irregularities, 2 suspicious overbilling patterns, and a clear violation of federal environmental compliance at their Ohio facility. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply said, interesting move in Section 7.3, reclassifying operational costs as research. Expenditures might fly under the radar short-term, but it will definitely trigger a federal playing audit. The silence in the room was suffocating. Margaret's eyes darted toward Douglas Crane, who was already shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Beads of sweat gathered on her brow. Excuse me? She asked, her voice faltering for the first time since the meeting began. Jonathan turned another page. Also, he added calmly, the productivity metrics from your Ohio plant don't align with its reported energy consumption. You're overstating efficiency by roughly 22%. Douglas stammered. How do you even have access to that data? Jonathan finally looked up, his gaze steady and sharp. Experience. And the public utility. Filings if you know where to look. Margaret's face drained of color. Her posture shifted from dominant to defensive in a matter of seconds. Then her phone rang. It was her legal counsel, Dr. Emerson Parker, and his voice, usually composed, was rushed, panicked. Margaret, we just received informal word from the SEC. Someone filed a complaint regarding accounting irregularities tied to the Orion initiative. Very specific data. Margaret, internal level specific. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. That's not possible. It is, Dr. Parker replied. And you need to get ahead of it now. Margaret looked at Jonathan like she was seeing him for the first time, not as a nuisance, consultant, but as a threat. A powerful, calculating one. What are you doing? She asked. Jonathan gave the faintest smile. Asking questions. Recording answers. Douglas exploded. Did you record this meeting? Jonathan reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, silver audio recorder. Yes, he said. And in New York State, only one party needs to consent. I consented. In that instant, everything unraveled. The phone on Margaret's desk rang again. This time, it was Richard Vaughn, chairman of the Tapla board. Margaret. His voice boomed through the speakerphone. I want an explanation. The financial press is blowing up. Allegations of racial discrimination, ethics complaints, SEC, inquiries. What the hell is going on over there? Margaret couldn't speak. Also, Vaughn continued, we just got word that Ellis Capital has withdrawn their $4 billion offer. Official reason, irreconcilable ethical concerns. Ellis Capital? Margaret repeated, stunned. But our contact was with Johnson Financial. Jonathan stood up for the first time since the meeting began. He pulled a gold-embossed business card from his pocket and laid it gently on the table. There is no Johnson Financial, he said. It's always been Ellis Capital. Margaret's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. I'm Jonathan Ellis, he continued, founder and CEO. We've been evaluating Whitmore Dynamics for 6 months, not just based on financial performance, but on values, leadership, and integrity. Today was the final evaluation. The air in the room thickened. No one spoke. No one laughed. Even Douglas looked pale. Margaret sank back into her chair, visibly shaken. The boardroom that once symbolized her dominance now echoed her downfall. I was never here to take notes, Jonathan said, voice still calm. I was here to observe, to see how you treat people when you don't think they matter. And what I've seen confirms everything my team suspected. Just then, Margaret's secretary buzzed in. Miss Whitmore, the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg are both on hold. They want your official response to the leaked audio. Margaret stared at the phone like it was a weapon. Meanwhile, Jonathan's phone vibrated again. A message from Marcus. Phase 2 complete. Audio sent to media, investors, civil rights groups. Trending on Twitter. He didn't even check. He didn't need to. Turning toward the window, Jonathan looked out over the skyline. The view Margaret had once used to assert superiority. Now, it symbolized collapse. He spoke without turning. You didn't just lose $4 billion today. You lost trust. And in our world, that's something money can't buy back. Before exiting, he paused at the door. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. What you do next will decide if this company survives or becomes a cautionary tale. And with that, Jonathan Ellis walked out, leaving behind the broken remnants of ego, prejudice, and false power. The sound of the door clicking shut behind Jonathan Ellis lingered in the boardroom like a sentence passed down by a silent judge. Margaret Whitmore sat frozen, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of her armrests, the air around her turning heavy with realization. The phone rang again, this time her personal cell. Miss Whitmore, came the panicked voice of her assistant. Social media is exploding. The #number, Justice for Jonathan, is trending nationally. The recording, it's everywhere. Margaret looked around at her executives, their faces drained of color. Douglas Crane stared blankly at the wall, his authority crumbling with each notification vibrating on his phone. Outside the boardroom window, the skyline still shimmered, but inside, Whitmore Dynamics was collapsing in real time. In the next room, the company's communications director was already being bombarded with press requests from the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, and Forbes. Investor hotlines were flooded. Institutional clients were demanding emergency calls. Stock value had plummeted 18% in just 2 hours, and it hadn't hit bottom yet. Meanwhile, 6 blocks away, Jonathan stood in the sleek, glass-walled office of Ellis Capital, overlooking the very city that once tried to ignore him. His team, a diverse group of 50 analysts, engineers, and strategists, worked in hushed efficiency, monitoring the unfolding fallout. His longtime deputy, Marcus Reed, stepped in holding a tablet. We're officially flooded, Marcus said, half smiling. 17 companies have reached out since the audio dropped, asking for us to conduct ethical audits of their executive teams before they finalize major mergers. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Ethical audits. That wasn't even a service line last month. It is now, Marcus replied. You started something, John. And he had. What began as one man calmly confronting arrogance had become a national reckoning. Universities, law firms, activist groups, and multinational investors were circulating the clip of Margaret Whitmore refusing to shake Jonathan's hand, paired with her dismissive line. Someone like you wouldn't understand our strategy, the audio hit a nerve. Within 24 hours, clips of Jonathan's calm takedown were being shared by celebrities, CEOs, and professors under captions like, "The most dignified revenge I've ever seen." He didn't raise his voice. He raised the standard. This is how you dismantle systemic arrogance. By the third day, Ellis Capital had gained 40% more investment proposals, and Jonathan was invited to keynote at business schools across the U.S., including Harvard, Wharton, and Columbia. A new narrative was emerging. Success rooted not in wealth or whiteness, but in character, intelligence, and integrity. Back at Whitmore Dynamics, the spiral accelerated. The SEC launched an official inquiry into the company's financial reports, particularly the Orion Initiative, where Jonathan had exposed multiple violations. 3 major stakeholders, publicly divested, citing ethics concerns. And an open letter from a coalition of corporate diversity groups called for Margaret's resignation. On the 5th day, the board convened an emergency meeting without her. Richard Vaughn, the chairman, delivered the message coldly. Margaret, we're relieving you of your duties, effective immediately. The firm will begin a leadership transition and cooperate fully with all investigations. Margaret didn't argue. She couldn't. Her reputation was beyond repair. The mansion in the Port, Hamptons, the yacht, the private events gone. She moved in with her sister in Connecticut, unreachable to the media. A woman once praised for executive brilliance was now a symbol of everything wrong with corporate elitism. But Jonathan Ellis didn't celebrate her fall. His goal had never been destruction. It was transformation. Instead of gloating, he focused on building. Using a portion of Ellis Capital's growing profits, Jonathan launched the Ellis Mentorship Initiative, a program supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs, analysts, and tech founders across the country. Within months, over 150 young professionals had received funding, training, and access to elite networks previously closed to them. One of them, Maria Sanchez, had been rejected by 16 different venture capital firms before Jonathan backed her. Her edtech startup, once dismissed as too niche, crossed $2 million valuation in just 6 months. You didn't just fund us, she told him at a networking event. You saw us. You believed in our brilliance. Jonathan smiled. That was the true victory, not in Margaret's downfall, but in the doors now, opening for people who once had none. On the wall of his new Manhattan office hung a simple black plaque with silver lettering. May your dignity always outlast their doubt. When asked why he never sued Whitmore Dynamics or sought compensation, Jonathan answered simply, they paid the highest price, already irrelevance. The real win was rewriting the rules of what power looks like. And with every passing day, as Ellis Capital grew and his story spread, Jonathan Ellis proved something corporate America could no longer ignore. True power doesn't humiliate. It elevates. 6 months had passed since that explosive meeting at Whitmore Dynamics, the meeting that dismantled a corporate empire and elevated Jonathan Ellis to a level of influence he had never sought, but now fully embraced. From his new office on the 52nd floor overlooking Manhattan, the city that once turned a blind eye to people like him now looked different. Not because the buildings had changed, but because he had, and because he was changing everything around him. Ellis Capital, once a respected but niche investment firm, had become a movement. The viral audio recording of Margaret Whitmore's arrogant dismissal and Jonathan's composed takedown had racked up over 8 million views, spawning documentaries, op-eds, and even graduate-level business ethics case studies. But for Jonathan, none of this was about fame. It was about impact. 17 new requests for ethical auditing just this week, said Marcus Reed, entering with a fresh stack of documents. And we've expanded our mentorship initiative to reach 5 new countries. Brazil, Kenya, Indonesia, Canada, and South Korea are all asking to adapt the Ellis Protocol. The Ellis Protocol, a set of investment standards prioritizing transparency, equal opportunity, and anti-discrimination, had become a gold standard for global corporations, seeking not just capital, but credibility. Jonathan smiled softly. All this, from one meeting they thought didn't matter. The irony wasn't lost on him. Margaret Whitmore had tried to humiliate him into silence. Instead, she handed him a microphone heard around the world, and the world had listened. News outlets dubbed him the man who turned humiliation into revolution. Forbes offered him the cover of their ethical leadership issue. Universities competed to host him for keynote lectures. Yet Jonathan declined the spotlight whenever possible. This was never about me, he reminded interviewers. It's about the systems, the culture, the doors that need to open and stay open for the next generation. That next generation was already arriving. Jonathan's firm had invested in over 100 underrepresented founders, many of whom had been previously overlooked due to race, background, or accents deemed unmarketable. His startup mentorship wing, the Ellis Launchpad, partnered with major institutions like MIT, HBCUs, and the London School of Economics to guide emerging talents into capital-ready ventures. In one emotional meeting, Tariq Johnson, a 23-year-old black AI researcher from Detroit, shared, "Before you, no one took my pitch seriously. I was told to tone down my passion. You didn't ask me to change. You asked how you could help." That was Jonathan's real victory, redefining what worth looks like in a world that had too often equated excellence with privilege. Meanwhile, Whitmore Dynamics collapsed fully just 4 months after the scandal. Bankruptcy filings revealed financial mismanagement even worse than anticipated. Margaret lost everything: the penthouse, the yacht, the board seats. Reports surfaced that she was now living with a relative in rural Connecticut, far from the boardrooms where she once reigned. She tried to contact Jonathan 17 times, left voicemails, sent letters, apologized. He listened to the first message, then deleted the rest. Because Jonathan's mission was no longer to change her. It was to change what made her possible. One morning, as sunlight poured into his office, Jonathan received a call from Dr. Evelyn Chang, Dean of Business Ethics at Columbia University. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "our faculty voted unanimously. We would like you to deliver this year's inaugural address on corporate justice and the future of capital." Jonathan paused, looking at the photo on his desk, a group shot of his 50-person team, one of the most diverse, talented firms in the country. "I'd be honored," he replied. That evening, he hosted a mentorship roundtable with 10 young entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds. One of them, Layla Martinez, had just landed her first $1.5 million seed round, thanks to Ellis Capital's connections. She looked up at Jonathan and said, "You turned your silence into a system. You didn't just open the door. You're building a whole highway." He chuckled humbly. "I'm just making sure no one else has to prove their worth twice just to be seen once." By now, the Ellis framework had been adopted by over 40 multinational corporations across 27 countries. Global investment banks began requiring internal diversity audits. Hiring boards started incorporating cultural humility as a leadership metric. Business schools revised their ethics curricula, all tracing back to one moment, one meeting, and one man who didn't raise his voice, but raise the bar. As Jonathan looked out across the skyline once again, he thought back to a younger version of himself, alone in a cheap apartment, reading annual reports late into the night, dreaming of being heard. Now, he wasn't just being heard, he was changing the conversation. And the best part? He wasn't the exception anymore. He was the blueprint. It wasn't the billions under management, the viral interviews, or the headlines that defined Jonathan Ellis in the end. It was what he built after the dust settled. 6 months after the downfall of Whitmore Dynamics, Jonathan stood in the bustling lobby of the Ellis Center for Ethical Leadership, a state-of-the-art mentorship hub in Manhattan, dedicated to nurturing young entrepreneurs, analysts, and visionaries from historically excluded communities. The walls were lined with portraits, not of wealthy founders, but of the first 100 graduates of his Launchpad initiative. Each face represented a story that once might have gone untold. As he waited for the next cohort to arrive, his assistant Jennifer stepped in. "Mr. Ellis, the group from the Global Youth Innovators Program is here. Most of them saw your Columbia keynote. They're nervous," she added with a smile. Jonathan chuckled. "Tell them they're not here to impress me. They're here to replace me." The elevator doors opened, and in walked 12 young men and women, each with their own fire, some quiet, some bold. Among them was Amari James, a 21-year-old former foster child from Baltimore developing a digital platform for accessible mental health services, and Noah Kim, a Korean-American coder who had been rejected by 4 accelerator programs before the Ellis team discovered his AI prototype. They gathered in the conference room, wide-eyed but eager. Jonathan didn't give them a lecture. He gave them truth. "I know what it's like to sit across a table from someone who doesn't believe you belong." "There," he began. "But let me be clear. You don't need their permission. You only need your purpose. And if your vision scares the people in power, then you're probably building this right thing." The room grew still, heavy with recognition. They weren't just hearing a speech. They were seeing what resilience looked like in real life. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to his office. On his desk was a small wooden plaque, sent by a group of student leaders from Morehouse College. It read, "You turn their silence into our signal." Next to it sat an envelope, another letter from Margaret Whitmore, her 17th. This one was handwritten, no excuses, no justifications, just remorse. She described how losing everything had forced her to confront the system she had once believed in and upheld. Jonathan placed it in a drawer alongside the others, unopened, not out of spite, but because that chapter had already served its purpose. Margaret's fall had sparked a global reckoning, but it was what followed. Jonathan's decision to build rather than destroy that had ignited a movement. He remembered his own beginnings, nights reading financial statements in a cramped apartment, learning the language of power in the quiet, being overlooked, talked down to, passed over. Every insult had been a brick in the fortress he now stood upon, not one built from bitterness, but from vision. As the sun set beyond the skyline, Marcus stepped into the room holding the latest analytics report. 62 companies in 21 countries have officially adopted the Ellis framework. And the United Nations just asked if you'd advise on a global inclusion charter. Jonathan took the report, nodded thoughtfully, then looked toward the framed photo on the wall, his team, a vibrant tapestry of race, gender, and culture, standing shoulder to shoulder. This was never about revenge. It was about making sure that no one else had to prove their humanity just to be heard. Across the world, boardrooms that once echoed with exclusion were now facing new expectations. Venture capital firms launched inclusion funds. Universities created scholarships in Jonathan's name. His mentorship program had directly supported over 500 startups, with a collective valuation of $800 million. But perhaps the greatest legacy was invisible, etched into hearts, not headlines. It lived in a young woman in Detroit pitching her first idea with confidence. In a teenage boy in Lagos, reading about Jonathan in an online journal and realizing that success wasn't just for others. In every boardroom where a young professional now walked in, chin raised, not asking to be accepted but daring to lead. Before leaving the office that night, Jonathan added a final note to his personal journal. True victory isn't taking someone down. It's building something they can never tear apart. I didn't want to be remembered for how I exposed them. I want to be remembered for how I redefined us all. As he stepped into the elevator, he carried no anger, only purpose. And as the doors closed, the final light in the office shimmered against the words engraved on the the glass behind his desk. Build louder than they doubt, and never let their smallness shrink your vision. Sometimes, the loudest revolution doesn't begin with a speech. It begins with a man extending his hand and being denied. Jonathan Ellis didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. He didn't storm out of that boardroom. The day Margaret Whitmore humiliated him, he simply listened, observed. And then he did what the truly powerful do. He built. What started as a moment of discrimination became a movement of transformation. Today, we remember Jonathan not because he crushed his enemies, but because he lifted everyone else. He could have chosen revenge. He could have burned the entire house down. Instead, he built a new one brick by brick, system by system, where people like him no longer had to knock, beg, or prove they belonged. He gave others what he was once denied, a seat at the table. And not just any table, but one where brilliance, not background, decides your value, where integrity matters more than legacy, where you aren't judged by your skin, your accent, or the car you drive, but by the fire in your ideas and the courage in your choices. Jonathan's greatest power wasn't his fortune. It was his forgiveness, and his belief that true justice isn't about humiliation, but reconstruction. That the best revenge is not destroying those who hurt you, it's building something so extraordinary that they become irrelevant in the light of your excellence. Through the Ellis Protocol, thousands of lives have changed. Through his mentorship programs, hundreds of young talents have launched businesses, patents, and global ventures. And through his quiet strength, millions have found something deeper. Hope. Hope that systems can change. Hope that dignity can win. Hope that maybe, just maybe, character still matters in a world driven by profit and pride. And now, the question turns to us. What kind of world are we building? Are we the Margarets clinging to power through fear and exclusion? Or are we the Jonathans measuring power not by what we own, but by what we enable into others? Because you don't need $1 billion fund to make a difference. You need integrity. You need courage. And you need the faith to keep building, even when no one else sees the foundation. He walked into that boardroom as just a consultant, and walked out as the man who redefined the rules of power. Jonathan Ellis never shouted. He never begged to be respected. He simply listened, observed, and waited. While others saw his quiet as weakness, it became his greatest weapon. What Margaret Whitmore failed to see is what many in power still miss today. True strength doesn't need to prove itself. It simply endures, and then it builds. In a world that told him no 1,000 times, Jonathan responded with something louder than anger, excellence. And in doing so, he didn't just change a company. He inspired a global movement. Never let someone else's underestimation become your limitation. Your worth isn't measured by their perception, but by your persistence. Let their doubt become your drive. Build with grace. Respond with brilliance. And most importantly, never shrink to fit their comfort. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to be part of something bigger. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you rise above it? Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that restore faith, inspire courage, and remind you that dignity always wins in the end. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We build a new standard, together.